This is a private wealth management firm, not a charity shelter. Take your garbage, take your delusions, and get out of my lobby before I have security drag you to the curb." The sound of the thick, cream-colored, watermarked paper tearing in half echoed through the cavernous marble lobby with the sharpness of a cracking whip. The man who had torn it, a senior branch manager wearing a bespoke Italian suit and a watch that cost more than a reliable car, let the two halves of the commercial loan application flutter to the freshly polished floor. He stepped forward, his polished Oxfords coming within inches of the applicant's worn, steel-toed work boots. He was breathing heavily, his chest puffed out in a display of primal, territorial dominance. The lobby, usually filled with the hushed murmurs of the city's ultra-wealthy, had gone entirely, sickeningly silent. The black man standing opposite him did not flinch. He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. His face remained an impassive mask of supreme, unnerving calm. He simply looked down at the torn paper on the floor, then slowly raised his eyes to meet the manager's flushed, angry face. A small vein pulsed on the side of the black man's neck, the only physical betrayal of the moment. He reached into the pocket of his faded canvas rain jacket, pulled out his phone, and typed a single, calm sentence to his attorney. He knew something the manager did not. He knew that in exactly 11 minutes, the manager's entire career, reputation, and financial security would be dismantled down to the studs. But before we get to that devastating collapse, to truly understand the gravity of what happened in that lobby, you need to go back. You need to understand exactly who was wearing that canvas jacket. The world before that Tuesday morning was a world built on silent, invisible labor. Marcus Thorne woke, as he had for the past 40 years, at 4:30 a.m. The air in his modest, meticulously kept brownstone smelled of jasmine from the garden outside and the sharp, bitter tang of dark roast coffee brewing in the kitchen. Marcus was a man carved from the bedrock of the working class. At 58 years old, his hands told the story of his life. The knuckles were permanently thickened, the skin layered with microscopic calluses, the nails neatly trimmed but carrying the faint, indelible memory of motor oil and copper wire. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man whose presence commanded a room not through volume, but through a profound, gravitational stillness. Before he checked his emails, before he looked at the global markets, Marcus engaged in his daily grounding ritual. He poured his coffee into a chipped, faded ceramic mug, a relic from a diner that had closed 2 decades ago, and sat at his kitchen island. Beside the mug, he placed a small, worn leather notebook and a silver pendant. The pendant had belonged to his mother, Alara. Alara Thorne had worked as a domestic housekeeper and a nighttime hospital janitor. She had scrubbed the floors of the very institutions that now dictated the city's economy. She had done so with a quiet, unyielding grace, coming home with hands smelling of lemon polish, harsh ammonia floor cleaner, and the soothing undertone of the cocoa butter she aggressively rubbed into her cracked skin. Marcus remembered the deep ache in her joints, the way she would sit in her armchair, icing her knees while reading to him from thick library books. She had given him one guiding philosophy, a sentence delivered in indirect speech that became the titanium spine of his existence. She had told him that the world would always try to appraise him based on the uniform he wore, but that dignity was not something handed down by a committee. It was a sanctuary you built inside yourself, and nobody could trespass there unless you handed them the key. "They will look at your clothes and think they know your worth," she had said, her voice a soft, melodic rumble. "But dignity isn't in the fabric, Marcus. It's in the spine. You never bow when you know you are the one holding the sky up." Marcus had taken that to heart. He had started as an apprentice electrician, working his way through engineering night classes. He didn't just string wire, he understood the flow of power. In the late 1990s, when the world was shifting toward high-speed digital infrastructure, Marcus saw the bottleneck. He spent 10 years in a sweltering garage, testing, failing, and rebuilding, until he developed a proprietary fiber optic routing conduit. It was an unglamorous piece of hardware, a gray box that sat in subterranean server farms. But that gray box was revolutionary. It reduced signal latency by 30%. Within a decade, Marcus's patents were licensed by every major telecommunications firm, stock exchange, and private banking network on the eastern seaboard. The very digital transactions that moved billions of dollars across the globe relied on the physical infrastructure Marcus had invented, patented, and fully owned. Marcus Thorne was quietly, invisibly, staggeringly wealthy. He was the sole proprietor of a holding company with assets exceeding $800 million. Yet he lived in the same neighborhood he grew up in. He funded community centers, bought up predatory payday loan buildings and turned them into financial literacy clinics, and maintained the appearance of a senior foreman. He still wore his Carhartt rain jacket. He still wore his scuffed second-hand Red Wing boots. He preferred clothes that allowed him to move, to work, to be comfortable. He had nothing to prove to strangers. His wealth was a tool, not a wardrobe. And on this particular Tuesday, he needed a very specific tool. He was finalizing a $500 million trust, an aggressive philanthropic venture designed to permanently endow 3 historically black colleges and underwrite minority-owned commercial real estate across the Midwest. His primary wealth managers had suggested establishing a new relationship with Wellington and Sterling Private Bank, a legacy institution known for its aggressive yields and historically its impenetrable exclusivity. Marcus had agreed, but he had a personal policy. Before he deposited $500 million into an institution, he tested their culture. He didn't send his lawyers. He didn't arrive in a limousine. He created a small, legitimate dummy, LLC, drew up a standard commercial loan application for $150,000 to renovate a local youth center, and walked through their front doors wearing his rain jacket and dusty boots. He wanted to see how the bank treated the least of its clients before he allowed them to manage the greatest of his assets. The downtown branch of Wellington and Sterling Private Bank was designed to intimidate. It was not merely a place of business. It was a temple erected to worship capital. The architecture was an aggressive display of wealth, soaring ceilings, imported Italian marble floors that echoed like a museum, and massive pillars of dark mahogany. The air inside the bank was climate-controlled to a crisp, sterile 68 degrees and carried the distinct, calculated scent of polished brass, high-end leather furniture, and the faint, citrusy notes of expensive cologne. Crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the vaulted ceiling, casting a cold golden light over the teller's stations. This was the fiefdom of Richard Sterling, the senior vice president and regional branch manager. Richard was a man who understood the world entirely through the lens of surface metrics. He was a 4th-generation banker, a man who had been handed a map to the finish line the day he was born. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit with a razor-sharp crease, a silk pocket square, and a $15,000 Patek Philippe watch that he deliberately exposed whenever he rested his hand on a table. Richard believed deeply in the hierarchy of appearances. To him, wealth had a look, a cadence, and a specific zip code. Richard's daily routine involved standing near the glass-walled conference rooms, surveying the lobby to ensure the aesthetic of the branch was maintained. He despised the recent corporate mandate to open a commercial lending window for small businesses in the lobby, viewing it as a contamination of his pristine environment. At 10:45 a.m., the heavy brass-handled doors of the bank opened and Marcus Thorne walked in. The contrast was immediate and jarring. In a sea of charcoal suits, pencil skirts, and designer briefcases, Marcus's faded green canvas rain jacket stood out like a warning beacon. The worn leather of his boots squeaked faintly against the flawless marble. He held a simple manila folder. He did not look around with the wide-eyed awe that Richard expected from civilians entering the branch. Instead, Marcus's eyes tracked the room with an engineer's precision, noting the security camera angles, the placement of the teller lines, and the structural load-bearing columns of the building. Richard, standing near the espresso machine in the VIP lounge, narrowed his eyes. The trigger was instantaneous. He saw a black man in work clothes standing in a space that Richard believed belonged exclusively to the generational elite. In Richard's mind, an equation instantly formulated: wrong clothes plus wrong skin color plus wrong neighborhood equals threat to the aesthetic. Marcus approached the commercial lending window. There were several bystanders in the lobby. A woman in a pale pink Chanel suit sat on a leather sofa, sipping sparkling water with ice clinking against the glass. A young tech executive in a cashmere sweater was scrolling on his phone. 2 middle-aged men in tailored suits were quietly discussing a merger near the entrance. Behind the glass of window number 3 stood Grace Anderson. Grace was a 24-year-old junior teller, fresh out of state college, carrying the heavy burden of student debt and a keen, empathetic awareness of the world. She saw Marcus approach, smiled warmly, and said, "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" "Good morning," Marcus replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried no strain. "I have an appointment with a loan officer to submit this commercial application for a neighborhood renovation project." He slid the neat, precisely typed manila folder across the marble counter. Grace opened the folder, her eyes scanning the immaculate documentation. "Everything looks perfectly in order, Mr. Thorne. Let me just page the commercial officer to come down." Before she could reach the intercom, a shadow fell over the counter. Richard Sterling had crossed the lobby. He did not introduce himself. He did not look at Marcus. He reached past Grace and snatched the manila folder from her hands. "Mr. Sterling, he has an appointment." Grace started, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll handle this, Grace," Richard snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. He flipped the folder open, glancing at the $150,000 figure, then at the name of the LLC, which bore no trace of Marcus's personal wealth. Richard finally looked at Marcus, his eyes raking up and down the canvas jacket, lingering on the cracked, thickened skin of Marcus's knuckles. A sneer, ugly and visceral, formed on Richard's face. An appointment, Richard said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. For a community center, in the South Ward. That is correct, Marcus said evenly. His posture remained perfectly straight. He did not lean on the counter. He stood with the quiet, terrifying solidity of an old oak tree. Richard let out a short, scoffing laugh. This is Wellington and Sterling. We manage wealth. We do not distribute charity to dilapidated neighborhoods, and we certainly do not entertain walk-ins who look like they just wandered off a construction site, looking for a handout. The escalation was sudden and sharp. The lobby grew quiet. The woman in the Chanel suit stopped sipping her water, intentionally averting her eyes, looking at a blank wall rather than witnessing the conflict. Complicity in silence. The tech executive pulled his phone closer to his chest, his thumb hovering over the record button, eager for spectacle but entirely unwilling to intervene. I am not asking for a handout, Marcus said, his voice dropping half an octave, becoming softer, which only seemed to infuriate Richard more. I am submitting a fully collateralized commercial application, as your institution publicly advertises. My institution, Richard said, his voice rising, ensuring the entire lobby could hear him assert his authority, has standards. Standards of clientele, standards of presentation. You are making my actual clients uncomfortable. Am I? Marcus asked softly, not looking around, keeping his dark, steady eyes locked directly onto Richard's flushing face. I know your type, Richard sneered, the quiet racism bleeding out of the subtext and into the sterile air of the room. You come in here thinking you can game the system, throwing around buzzwords, demanding access to capital you haven't earned in a space you don't belong in. Look at you belong at a check-cashing storefront, not in a private wealth lobby. Grace, the junior teller, went pale. Mr. Sterling, please. His paperwork is completely verified. Quiet, Grace, or you'll be boxing up your desk by noon, Richard snapped. He turned back to Marcus. The fatal flaw of arrogant men is that they believe their power is permanent. Richard wanted a public victory. He wanted to humiliate this man, to reinforce the invisible borders of his world. I'm going to save my loan officers the time of declining this, Richard said loudly. He gripped the thick paper of the application in both hands. I would strongly advise you not to do that, Marcus said. Yes. The warning was not a threat. It was a factual statement delivered with the absolute, chilling calm of a man who held all the cards. Richard smirked. Get out of my lobby before I have you arrested for loitering. And then, Richard Sterling tore the application in half. The sound of the tearing paper was loud. The two halves fluttered to the marble floor. Richard stepped forward, breathing heavily, chest puffed. Security! He called out, waving to a uniformed guard near the door. Escort this man off the premises. If he resists, call the police. This was the moment of maximum humiliation. The bystanders watched. The man filming finally tapped the red record button, safely hidden behind a pillar. The woman in the pink suit looked at her shoes. They were all complicit, enablers of a system that allowed a man in a tailored suit to crush a man in a canvas jacket simply because of the visual geometry of power. But Marcus Thorne did not react the way Richard anticipated. Marcus did not shout. He did not curse. He did not beg. He did not scramble to pick up the torn pieces of his application. He simply looked down at the ruined paper, the physical embodiment of a small, hopeful community project, and then looked back up at Richard. Marcus took a slow, deep breath. The scent of sandalwood and ammonia filled his lungs. He felt the familiar weight of his mother's memory, her voice whispering, "Dignity is in the spine." He felt the cold air of the air conditioning against the slight perspiration on his forehead. He reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a sleek, unassuming smartphone. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features at Marcus's eerie lack of emotional response. "Are you taking a picture? I told you to get out." Marcus ignored him. He looked at the time on his phone screen. Exactly 11:14 a.m. He opened his messaging app, navigated to a contact labeled Arthur Vance, General Counsel, and typed a single message, Execution Protocol Alpha. The branch is Wellington and Sterling downtown. Proceed. Marcus slid the phone back into his pocket. He looked at Grace, the pale, trembling teller. Thank you for your professionalism, young lady. You are a credit to yourself. Are you deaf? Richard shouted, the veneer of his elite banking persona cracking completely. I said leave. I am waiting, Marcus said quietly, folding his thick, calloused hands in front of him. It won't be long. The standoff lasted exactly 8 excruciating minutes. Richard paced behind the glass, his face red, continually glancing at the doors, waiting for the police he had instructed security to call. Marcus simply stood there, an immovable object, completely at peace within his own skin. His heart rate had not elevated. He was a man who understood how systems worked, and he was currently watching one short circuit in real time. At 11:22 a.m., the heavy brass front doors did not just open, they were pushed wide by a team of 4 men. The man leading them was Victor Steele, the global head of private wealth management for Wellington and Sterling, a man who operated 3 levels above Richard. Victor was flanked by the bank's chief compliance officer and 2 grim-faced corporate auditors carrying thick, locked leather briefcases. Victor Steele was a man who usually moved with relaxed, confident grace. Today, he looked like a man sprinting toward a bomb that was about to detonate. He power-walked across the marble floor, his eyes frantically scanning the lobby. Richard, seeing his ultimate boss enter the branch unannounced, instantly transformed. The sneer vanished, replaced by a desperate, sycophantic smile. He rushed out from behind the teller counter, straightening his tie. Mr. Steele! Victor, sir! What an unexpected honor! We weren't expecting— Victor Steele walked straight past Richard as if he were a piece of furniture. He walked directly toward the black man in the faded rain jacket. Victor stopped 3 feet from Marcus. The powerful executive, a man who routinely dined with senators and tech billionaires, took a deep breath and bowed his head slightly. Mr. Thorne, Victor said, his voice carrying clearly through the dead silence of the lobby. I received a call from your general counsel 3 minutes ago. I apologize for the delay. Has my branch manager made you comfortable while we finalize the transfer? The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of tension. It was the absolute, suffocating vacuum of a paradigm shifting violently on its axis. Richard Sterling froze mid-step. The color physically drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The bystanders, the woman in the pink suit, the man with the phone, stared in shock. Comfortable is not the word I would use, Victor, Marcus said, his voice smooth and cold as river stones. I don't understand, Richard stammered, stepping forward, his knees visibly shaking, his $15,000 watch suddenly looking like a cheap handcuff. Victor, Mr. Steele, this man is a walk-in. He was demanding a low-tier loan. He was harassing the tellers. I was just having him removed. Victor turned to Richard, his eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and absolute fury. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. Richard, you absolute fool, Victor hissed, the corporate polish entirely stripped away. This is Marcus Thorne. He is the founder and sole proprietor of Thorne Infrastructure Data. He owns the patents to the fiber optic networks that process every single trade this bank makes. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, he is the primary signatory on a $500 million trust that we have spent 14 months begging him to let us manage. Victor looked down at the floor, seeing the torn pieces of the manila folder. He closed his eyes, a pained grimace crossing his features. Did you tear up his paperwork? Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. He was wearing— Richard choked on the words, realizing for the first time how deeply, fatally absurd his defense sounded out loud. He didn't look. Marcus Thorne finally moved. He took 1 step toward Richard. The physical deterioration of the antagonist was stark. Richard shrank back, his shoulders hunching, all the false bravado collapsing inward. When Marcus spoke, it was a calm, devastating monologue. He did not shout. He spoke with the absolute, terrifying moral authority of a man who had built a kingdom with his own bare hands. You walked into this lobby today believing you own the world because your name is on a polished plaque, Marcus began, his voice echoing off the marble. You stand in a building cooled by systems my company designed. You process transactions on a digital network my patents built. You benefit from the labor of my mind and my hands every single second you breathe in this space. Marcus paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The man filming on his phone was shaking. And when you saw a black man standing in a space you falsely believed you controlled, the very first thing you did was attempt to strip him of his humanity. You didn't ask questions. You didn't read the files. You saw a canvas jacket. You saw the color of my skin. and you decided I was garbage that needed to be swept to the curb. Marcus pointed to the torn paper on the floor. I didn't come here to cause a scene. I didn't come here to demand respect I haven't earned. You, however, committed the fatal error of assuming that arrogance is a substitute for competence. Marcus turned his attention back to Victor Steele. Victor, the $500 million trust will not be managed by Wellington and Sterling. You have lost the account. Furthermore, I am initiating a full withdrawal of all Thorn Infrastructure corporate operating accounts from your global network, effective by close of business today. Victor looked as though he had been physically struck. Mr. Thorn, please, this is an isolated incident. This man does not represent our values. We can rectify this. We can fire him right now. You will fire him, Marcus agreed softly. But the rot is in the foundation, Victor. A system that empowers a man like this to humiliate working-class people without fear of consequence is a system I will not finance. Marcus looked back at Richard, who was now leaning against a mahogany pillar just to keep himself upright. You thought you were tearing up a $150,000 loan for a community center, Marcus said to Richard. You just tore up a $500 million portfolio and your entire career. Pick up the paper, Richard. Richard stared at him, paralyzed. Pick it up, Victor commanded, his voice cracking with rage. Slowly, agonizingly, the senior vice president of elite banking sank to his knees in his custom Italian suit. He reached out with trembling hands and picked up the 2 torn halves of the community center loan application. He knelt there on the marble floor, completely broken in front of the lobby he had terrorized just 10 minutes prior. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He turned to the teller window and looked at Grace, who was staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Grace, Marcus said gently, when you are ready to leave this toxic environment, call the number on the business card attached to that torn file. My foundation is always looking for smart, compassionate people who know how to treat human beings. Marcus Thorn turned and walked toward the brass doors. He didn't look back as the auditors swarmed Richard's desk, or as Victor Steele began shouting orders to freeze the branch's operations. Marcus pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. The reckoning that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely documented. Within 48 hours, the reality of what had transpired in the lobby hit the financial world like a seismic event. The numbers were staggering, concrete, and unsparing. The immediate loss of the $500 million trust was only the first domino. When Marcus withdrew Thorn Infrastructure's corporate operating accounts, Wellington and Sterling saw an immediate liquidity drain of $320 million. The story, captured by the bystander and leaked, anonymously of course, to the financial press, triggered a catastrophic PR crisis. Wellington and Sterling's stock dipped 4.2% in a single day of trading, wiping out nearly $1.4 billion in market capitalization. Richard Sterling was not allowed to resign. He was terminated with cause, stripped of his severance package, and his unvested stock options, valued at roughly $2.1 million, were voided under a moral turpitude clause in his contract. Because his termination involved a documented civil rights violation regarding lending practices, an investigation was opened by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Richard found himself unemployable in the financial sector, blacklisted by an industry that only tolerates arrogance when it doesn't cost them $500 million. But true justice is never just about punishing the wicked. It is about changing the machinery of the institution. Marcus Thorn did not let the matter rest with a viral video. His legal team filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against Wellington and Sterling, forcing discovery on their lending practices across all branches. The resulting settlement wasn't just a check, it was a legally binding consent decree. The bank was forced to overhaul its entire internal bias training protocol. More importantly, they were required to commit $50 million specifically to zero-interest commercial loans for minority-owned, small businesses in the very neighborhoods Richard had sneered at. The program was quietly named the Alara Initiative, after a woman who used to scrub their floors. Grace, the junior teller who had treated Marcus with dignity, took his advice. Marcus watched her, feeling the warm, heavy silver of his mother's pendant resting against his chest. He reached over, using a clean corner of his handkerchief to wipe a smudge of dirt from Maya's cheek. Grandpa, Maya asked, her voice high and clear, why do we have to push the seeds down so deep into the dirt? Why can't we just leave them on top where it's clean? Marcus smiled, a slow, gentle expression that softened the hard lines of his face. He picked up a handful of the dark earth, letting it sift through his calloused fingers. Because, little bird, Marcus said softly, the surface is just where things look pretty for a little while. But the roots have to push through the dark, through the hard dirt, to find the water. If you only live on the surface, the first strong wind will blow you away. But if your roots are deep, it doesn't matter what kind of storm comes, you'll stand tall. He looked at his hands, thinking of his mother, thinking of the long, quiet years of labor, thinking of the sneer on a banker's face that had melted into terror. "They can look at the leaves all they want," Marcus whispered, pulling his granddaughter into a side hug. "But we know who owns the soil." A bank manager looked at a black man in a worn canvas jacket and decided he was worthless, entirely unaware that he was insulting the very architect of the bank's digital wealth. But what really made this story matter wasn't the twist. It wasn't the $500 million shock or the catastrophic firing of an arrogant executive. What made this story matter was the absolute, unshakable calm of a man who knew his own worth before anyone else validated it. Marcus didn't scream to prove he was important. He let his reality speak for itself. Where in your own life are you letting someone else's shallow assumptions dictate your deep value? Who are you allowing to appraise your worth based on the uniform you wear or the background you come from? Share this story with someone who is quietly grinding right now, someone who needs to be reminded that their current struggle is building a foundation that arrogant people will one day have to stand on. Subscribe to this channel as we continue to document real stories of systemic justice, holding institutions accountable one truth at a time. Dignity doesn't need a marble lobby or a tailored suit. It just needs a spine that refuses to bend to ignorance. Remember that,